everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar, Navigating the Challenges of Parenting in 2020. My name is Laura Guyers-Burke, and I work for the Australian Child and Adolescent Trauma, Loss and Grief Network, also known as a CATLN, at the Australian National University. I'd like to just start it off in the spirit of reconciliation. A CATLN and UNICEF Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us this evening. So I see a few more people are still joining, so we'll just continue on. They can hop on. I'm just going to go over a few of the tech housekeeping notes for this evening. As this is a webinar, your audio and video are disabled as attendees, but the chat feature is enabled, and I see we do have a couple of messages already on there. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi or comment on something you hear, and let us know of any tech issues that you might experience. Hopefully not. This webinar is being recorded, so a link will be sent out to all registrants following the live event this evening. Tonight's webinar will also include a chance for some Q&A with our great panelists who you'll get to meet in a few minutes. And if you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat. That'll avoid questions getting too buried. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible without going over our scheduled wrap-up time of 8:45 tonight. And finally, once the webinar ends at 8:45, an evaluation survey should open for you automatically. We would greatly appreciate you taking the few minutes to fill this out. It's just a few short questions, and it gives us some valuable feedback about how this webinar was received, and it helps us shape our future webinars as well. With that, I'd now like to introduce Nicole Breeze, who is the Director of Australian Programs at UNICEF Australia, and invite her to say a few words.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Laura. Yes, I'm Nicole Breeze, and I'm the Director of Australian Programs at UNICEF Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that tonight I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. As many of you will know, UNICEF works to protect and promote the rights and well-being of children here in Australia and in 190 countries around the world. As an organisation focused on children, we believe that the role of parent or caregiver is such a valuable and important role, and one that we need to embrace and celebrate across all elements of our society. We also know that it's a role that isn't always easy, and 2020 continues to throw all sorts of challenges at us and our communities. We were looking for a way to recognise and support the tremendous contribution that parents and caregivers are making across the country during these times. And that's why we've teamed up with our friends at CATLN at the ANU to offer some practical and constructive tips tonight via this webinar. So on behalf of UNICEF Australia, I'd like to say thank you, firstly, for all that you do as parents and caregivers. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all this evening. I'd also like to take this moment to say a special thank you to those of you who are supporters of UNICEF Australia, because without you, none of the work we do for children would be at all possible. Finally, I failed to mention that I myself am a mother to two children, a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. So I'm also extremely keen to benefit from the insights from our panelists tonight. And so with that, without any further ado, I'll hand across to our host for this evening, Nicola Palfrey, and ask Nicola to introduce herself and get us going.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you all here tonight. We've got just over 100 participants already, which is fantastic. I know that there is an awful lot going on for families across Australia at the moment. Every hour, it seems like there's new information to digest, new concerns, new financial strains, new schooling arrangements, everything to adapt. So I want to, first of all, acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Ngunnawal people here in sunny Canberra, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families to our heritage and to the ongoing culture and continuation of our life here in Australia. I also want to recognise that we have people from all over Australia joining us tonight. We've had registrations from every state and territory as far as I know, which is really exciting. We'll be asking you in a little while to tell us where you're from so we can get a little bit of a sense of who's on the other side of this virtual meeting that we're having tonight. But as part of that, every state, territory, big town, little town is going through its own challenges at the moment, not just from COVID-19, but off the back of continued drought, the terrible summer of bushfires we had, the floods, and just ongoing adversity and challenges that every family is experiencing and went into this year with already. So the phrase that's been used a lot, and a poem that Damien Barr, I think, has been credited with across Twitter, which references we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And that's the spirit in which we'd like to conduct tonight's webinar, which is with a sense of collegiality and a sense that all looking after each other and providing as much information and support as we can, but a recognition that the challenges that each of us face are completely different. Some of us are going back into lockdown, some of us are living in situations where there's currently no live cases. It's a different circumstance for everyone, and no one's got it easy. It's just all challenging in different ways. So I'd ask everybody to be mindful of that. We're trying to cover that. We've got a panel from across the eastern seaboard of Australia tonight, but we are hoping to reach across the whole country and share some of the wisdom of the panelists. So quick poll, if you can, click along. We'd love to see where people are joining us from tonight so we can get a sense of the representation that we have. A couple of other things to note. We've given the speakers the challenge of kind of sharing their wisdom about how on earth to navigate this year in approximately 9 minutes each tonight. And the reason we've done that is because we wanted to get a bit of a teaser of their distinct perspective. So Lisa will be kicking us off, and then we'll go to Simon and Michelle, each of whom have got their own clinical experience, their own personal experiences, obviously, of both family, but also of working in this field for a long time and working with lots of families. That's why we got them here tonight. But we've also left a lot of time for Q&A at the end of the session tonight. So we've left just over half an hour. And the reason for that is it's much more interesting for us to have a conversation rather than just us preach at you. And so as we're going along tonight, use the chat function to chat to each other and share insights. Use the Q&A button as you go along. Just to the right of that, you can see that there's a Q&A. Would ask you to put any questions for the panelists there. Laura and I will be facilitating that and sharing that towards the end of the session. So we've got, we need a Northern Territory, and my Tasmanian, my hometown, its home state needs to jump on board. But we have representation there from most of the states and territories. We did Northern Territory and Tassie to come on board. So that's fantastic. It's nice to see people joining us. The Western Australian parents may well still be at work. So remember that if you enjoy tonight, it will be recorded and you can share it with anybody else that you might think would benefit from it. The other thing I want to mention just quickly before I hand over and get this underway is this is very important, what we're calling a universal webinar. It's for everybody. It's anybody who's welcome to come along, and we're really grateful for the support of UNICEF Australia and being able to bring this to you and make it freely available. This webinar tonight is the first in a series, and the series that we're following up this one with are a little bit different. So this is what we're calling a universal webinar for everybody. So we may have several hundred attendees coming along tonight. After this session, we'll be asking if you are interested to contact us, because we're going to be running some more targeted group sessions, and what they will be is limited to 12 participants each, along with one of the panelists and myself, and there'll be 3 group sessions. So they'll be targeted around the expertise of the panelists, and we'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along tonight. But have a think if that's something that you're listening to one of our speakers tonight and you'd like to know more, please be aware that that will be available. Again, they will be freely available, but we hope it will be hotly contested because there's only 12 spots in each of those groups of 3 sessions. So 3 groups of 3 sessions. So without further ado, I won't hold you up anymore, I want to introduce our first speaker today, which is Lisa Oxman. Lisa is a clinical psychologist and also works at the ANU as a lecturer in clinical psychology and teaching the budding psychologists of the future. I had the privilege of working with Lisa, studying under Lisa, and I really was keen for Lisa to come along today to share with you all her insights and views of parenting, of its challenges, and in particular her approach to how we can all weather this storm, whatever boat we're in, with some compassion for our kids, for ourselves, and also for each other. So over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Very much. All right, now I am going to share my screen. What a year it has been. Some people are saying 2020 is like a decade in itself, and it's been such an emotionally demanding year, to start with the fires and then moving through all the COVID experience, the various collective grief that we're experiencing in different ways about the way the world has changed. It's been huge, and parenting has long been described as one of the most difficult challenges that people can do, and also one of the most joyous, but 2020 has put that on steroids and made an already challenging task even more challenging. So one of the things I'd invite you to do is to consider what has been your top 5 challenges of parenting this year, and also too, what's been your top 5 joys, what's been most rewarding. And if you can get clear, the idea of this, if you can get clear about what your top 5 challenges are, that gives information about where support might be useful and what help might be useful to get. But equally so, if you work out what your top 5 joys are, it's a way of working out what matters to you and what's important to you and what delights you in being a parent. And in thinking about the challenges of 2020, I think one of the blessings and curses of being in the internet age is that we have access to so much information, a vast array of information. And as I'm sure anyone listening tonight is aware, people have a lot of opinions about parenting, very strong opinions about parenting. It's easy to get conflicting messages. It's easy to feel unsure and confused. And even though most parents, I'd say, really want to do the best by their child or children, it can be hard to get a clear sense of what that means sometimes as life evolves and changes when there are so many conflicting messages. Now, I don't think anyone who, when they're holding a little one in their arms for the first time, and looking into the vulnerable eyes of this child is thinking, I can't wait to mess you up. Yeah, I mean, really, our intent is so pure and we want the best for our children, but there are many reasons why that can go awry or go askew. And I'm not going to cover all the reasons today, but I do want to recognise and acknowledge there's complexity, a vast array of complexity. What I'm focusing on tonight is the importance of connection. That is, a relationship that's consistent enough, trustworthy enough, reliable enough, and one in which repairs can happen, in which misunderstandings can be repaired, and through the willingness to do repair, a trustworthy relationship can develop that helps navigate the inevitable challenges of helping a small young person emerge into an adult. Now, despite the vehemence with which opinions can be held, there is no one right way of parenting. There are some very clear don'ts. There are ways that we can physically and emotionally harm children. I'm not going to go into all of them, but shaming, physically hurting, intimidating, all of those things, I'm sure you get the picture. That is definitely damaging. And so there are clear don'ts, but there's not a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter mold that has a clear answer on how to do everything. And if you're keen to look into various ways that parenting is done across the globe, because this will demonstrate there's no one way, one book you could look at, as you see on the screen, is How Eskimos Keep Their Baby Warm. This book's written by a Taiwanese woman who was adopted by an American family, who later raised her children in Argentina and also got to know her biological family from Taiwan. And this gave her an insight that in different cultures, people do things differently. The other thing too is that it depends on the temperament of the child we've got and the person that's with us, that one thing that works for one child may not work for another. So while I said there may be some clear don'ts in raising children, but it can be challenging to work out what's a good enough approach for the child in front of you. and to recognise that this good enough approach may be different for different children, even within the same family. And as anyone who's ever met more than one child knows, children come into the world differently, and different temperaments, different ways of relating in the world around them. And that's why there's no one single approach that works for all children. What might be adventurous and exciting for one child is anxiety provoking and overwhelming for another. What might be humorous and playful for one child might feel wounding and tender for another. One child we might relate to as easygoing, and another might be more likely to challenge us when we ask them to do something. And in that moment, they feel more difficult. And I do suggest that if you recognise that you are often in power struggles with your child or one of your children, that I'd recommend looking at the work of Laura Markham from AHA Parenting. She has some lovely material, a whole vast array of information on parenting, but in particular looking at how to work with what she refers to as strong-willed children and how to raise them towards being adults without breaking their spirit. Now, one of the challenges of parenting is doing all that needs to be done, all that pragmatic stuff that has to get done, whilst tending to the relationship. And we do know that if we can do this, and if we can tend to the relationship, and having a consistent connection can make getting that pragmatic stuff done slightly easier. Not perfect. There is no perfect in parenting. Children don't actually need perfection from us. They need the ability to do repair, as I said. And so that's what we want, this connection that makes getting the pragmatic stuff done easier, and on the really hard days, less worse. I'd highlight too, I'm quoting Maya Angelou here, that highlighted that people will often forget what you've said, people forget what you did, but they never forget how you made them feel. And so I'd invite everyone listening today to think about a teacher or a boss that you've had that you really, really disliked working for. And to think about, what did that person do that had you dislike working for them? And what did that make you feel like doing in and of yourself? We know that bad bosses often have people wanting to steal pens, come in late, take long lunches, leave early. We get the picture. And so I'd like you to think, just to reflect on what that was like to be in the position if you've had experienced either a bad boss or maybe not a great teacher. And then on the converse side, I'd like you to think about a teacher you had or a boss that you had that you really respected and liked, and who brought out the best in you. And what was it that they did that allowed that to happen? Great leaders bring out the best in us and help us to find a way to do things even in difficult, challenging moments. And they're the people we can go to when we've failed. And lastly, I'd like you to consider, what sort of boss are you on the for you and your child or children? On the continuum of kind of bad boss to great boss, where would you put yourself at the moment? And this is an ebb and flow. But it's worth considering, am I creating employees that want to bring out the best of themselves, or employees that want to steal pens? Now, I do want to highlight this analogy falls down in the sense that in a workplace generally, we're not allowed to have temper tantrums, and our boss doesn't have to unconditionally love us in that sense. I also like to highlight that it's possible that children can actually say to us, I hate you, and be angry with us, and still come out of a childhood with a sense of being loved. And this comes back to, again, how do we tend to the relationship? Pardon me, how do we tend to the relationship? So I do want to add as well that one of the particular challenges of 2020 is that we had a whole nother aspect added to our repertoire of what it was to be a parent. And that is that we took on the role, many of us had to take on the role of being an educator as well, or at least step into the role of overseeing what schools asked. Now, I refer to this as the overseer of educational material put together hastily for long distance education. I am loath to call it homeschooling, because homeschooling is a completely different situation in which the curriculum is taught by and designed by the person who's taken on that role to being a committed homeschool educator. Now, many parents describe the absolute blood pressure raising experience of not only having to adapt one's own work to the online situation and working from home, but also needing to ensure a child or children got homework done that was set by the school that maybe they weren't that interested in doing. And so we want to highlight, I also do want to highlight that some students or children found their sweet spot in that and actually preferred working from home. As Nicola said, we're in the same storm but not the same boat, and highlighting that different situations work for different kids. But many people described there was this huge tension in getting schoolwork done, and that this was often came at the cost of the relationship. Now, given that we're about halfway through the year and there's still a long way to go, and for some people are back in lockdown, some people in quarantine, there's a chance that we all might be at some point, what I'd invite you to consider is, what have you learned from the year so far? What have you learned about what's worth getting caught up in and also what's worth letting go of? And so I would also suggest that it's worth writing some of this down so that your future stressed self doesn't have to remember it. But you can use this as a guiding light in a sense of, what is it that I want to tend to? And what's one thing that you want to focus on in terms of the quality of the relationship you have with your child or children? What's one thing that you want to look back on and be proud of for yourself? And it may be worth thinking about this from the perspective of your child or children. When they're in their 20s, when they look back on their childhood, how do you want them to remember how you made them feel? Now, this is tricky, right? How do we let children become who they are while setting limits and boundaries that align with our values and what works for our own household? And how do we be kind on ourselves as we grow in the process of parenting and realize it's not only about helping our children grow, but also making a sense of what's in our own history that pushes our buttons? Parenting is absolutely a roller coaster ride. Nothing will change that. That's the deal. There are highs and there are lows. Getting clear about what matters to you and living this helps make the inevitable stresses more manageable and the joys even more delightful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for getting that started. I think you've set a really great tone to start the webinar off tonight, particularly touching on the roller coaster ride that is parenting, which is obviously a pretty key theme for the webinar tonight and for 2020 overall. And I think you also touched on one of the really probably crucial stresses for a lot of parents is having to take on new roles amidst COVID and lockdown, and one of those roles being pseudo-educator. And I think that that's probably something that a lot of parents have felt the stress of throughout this time, and potentially going forward if we are to move back into another lockdown, as Victoria has already. So thank you again, Lisa. I'd like to introduce our next panelist now. Simon Santosa is the Managing Director of Men and Family Counseling and Consultancy on the Gold Coast. He's an accredited mental health and social worker and has more than 20 years of clinical experience working with men, women, and families dealing with complex trauma, mental health, and family relationship issues. And tonight we really wanted to have well, a man amongst this panel of women, and someone to really give that perspective. And Simon is really an expert when it comes to working with men, and it's going to be really valuable for him to share his experiences tonight, as I know that throughout COVID and the challenges of 2020, perhaps there are many fathers who've been taking on roles within the household that are outside of what they would normally cover off in their role. And that's likely going to be an adjustment for some. And I think Simon will be able to speak to that and so much more. So thank you. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Laura, for that introduction. I work a lot with men, and I've worked with men and their families for over 20 years. And in the last 6 months, especially since the bushfires, since COVID, I'm working more and more with men that have lost their jobs, men who are caring for their kids, sometimes full-time, sometimes part-time. A lot of couples under intense relationship stress. Many families under incredible financial stress. This year, and especially under COVID-19, has meant that we all are dealing with a low sense of control over the things in our life, and especially the big things like jobs and financial situations. And that can cause a lot of problems for us blokes, because now we're placed in situations which there's no roadmap for. And a lot of the fathers that I'm working with are struggling, and we have to go back to some of the messages we get early on when we're boys. We're taught, we soak up these messages like a sponge on a wet floor. A lot of dads soak up messages that I need as a man. We've got to be tough. We've got to be strong. We've got to be the provider. Feelings are a sign of weakness. That we've just got to soldier on and be stoic. But what happens when we're placed in a situation which conflicts with all the ideas in our head of how we should be? Take the I guess, the idea that men don't feel. If we look at our brains, and this is a brain, there's a rational brain. In here, the limbic system, there's a whole area dedicated to feelings, feeling loss, feeling helpless, feeling shame. So what happens when, through no fault of our own, we lose our jobs, whole sectors shut down, whole industries shut down, we lose our house, the slow government bureaucracy, we can't tend to rebuild as fast as we like. What happens when we actually start feeling powerless and start feeling helpless? It goes against all those ideas that as a man, I'm meant to be able to fix things. I'm meant to be 10 foot tall and bulletproof. I'm meant to care and protect for my family. So I'm seeing an increasingly lot of dads struggle. They're struggling, and you watching, if you're a dad watching this, or if you're a mum watching this, you might see some of these behaviours in the fathers. And most of the guys that I work with, they say, well, when I'm going through tough times, I'll isolate, I'll shut down. I don't want my family to know that I'm struggling inside. I might become a little bit more angry or controlling, they'll tell me. A lot of couples that I'm seeing experiencing difficulties, arguing, fighting. Often a lot of dads are becoming less tolerant with their children, especially because we're locked into a house 24/7 through the lockdowns. We might start using drugs and alcohol, experience low moods, and feel reluctant to reach out and ask for help because we want to fix it ourselves. And so that's where a lot of the struggles are. When I see guys, they're not traveling too well, but they're reluctant to reach out for help. And a lot of my work is trying to reframe this situation. Yes, there's so much that we don't have control over, but what we do have control over is how we are in our families. And one of the best ways to kind of reframe this as fathers is if you just Google some of the literature about the positive impacts on fathering and the positive impacts we bring into our children's life. A lot of men are brought up to believe that our only role in the household is our provider status, that we're walking wallets. The last 20 years of fathering research tells us we're far more than walking wallets. Our kids not only need us to maybe provide alongside these days our partner, because often it takes two, but they need our presence, because the more involved we are, the more flexible we are, the more connected we are with what's going on at home, the better the social skills with our kids, the higher successful relationships, the stronger self-esteem, higher grades, less likely to be overweight, less likely to take drugs. There's a whole lot of positive benefits, because what happens, if you look at the small screen there, there's all these wires I'm holding up, and what we're effectively doing is we're rebuilding our children's brain. We think that our only role is to provide, and what happens when we lose that provider status as fathers? A lot of us think we've somehow failed our family, and we tend to feel a deep sense of shame. A lot of the dads I work with have a deep sense of shame about being on JobKeeper, about being on JobSeeker, something they'd never thought they'd go on. But actual fact, you being at home gives you a chance that it's very few. When you look at How often we work, we spend our whole lives working. How often do we get a chance to spend a 2-month or 3-month period, maybe even longer for some people back in a lockdown, with our children and our families? And we know that if you're present with your families, this time, these 2 months, these 3 months, will create changes in your children's brain, which they will benefit from years down the track. It's kind of like building solid foundations in your children. There's 4 things you can do to really refocus. And the first thing is rather than look at and focus on all the things we can't do, because there is so much out of our control, let's reframe it into what we can do. Because if you focus on your kids and do that Google search, and I ask everyone to do that, on the benefits of positive fathering to children's life, there's a wealth of research now. We know that being at home, even though you might think as a dad that somehow you failed, you haven't failed. If you're able to see this time, remember this shall pass, and we've got 2 or 3 months, maybe longer, to really connect with our kids. And if we can reframe it, then we can connect. As Lisa was saying, connection is really important. The more we connect with our children, the more we connect with our partners, the better the outcomes. Beyond Blue's released a lot of studies that says that one of the biggest problems we face as men is social disconnection, that when we're going through tough times, we tend to isolate, shut down, and push away the people in our lives that love us the most. But if we are able to refocus and go and kick a ball with our kids, go and make a date night with our partners, show our children how to change a washer, say, or work on the car, those kind of things, those side-by-side activities are really important for building those positive connections in children. The other really important thing that we need to do as men is regulate our emotions, because we know from all the mental health statistics that when men are stressed, depressed, our anger and aggression levels actually go up. And that actually impacts on the people around us. For instance, I always say to dads that our children are the barometer for where we are at. So next time there's the kids are acting out and maybe getting angry, or maybe not behaving in ways that you would like them to behave, it's just for an idea. Try and experiment and just take a step back and tune into where you're at. Are you feeling a bit angry at the situation? Are you feeling a bit stressed at the situation? Have you disconnected a little bit? Are you drinking a lot more than is healthy? There's often, when the children start acting up, we're not right. And the best thing we can do is take steps to make ourselves feel better by going for a run, by breathing, by mindfulness, or maybe just connecting with a mate. And the most important thing of all is seek support if you or your family are not traveling well. It's kind of like if you're on an aeroplane, they always teach you if there's turbulence to fit your own mask first, and then you're able to look after your children. If you're not traveling right as a dad, if you're feeling not right, then that's going to impact on your whole family. It's kind of like if your car gets bogged and you put your foot on the accelerator to try and get out, and you just dig yourself deeper into the hole. But waving someone down and getting a tow out, you'll be able to get a lot more support. So there's a lot of organisations, a lot of services around that are supporting men in male-focused ways. There is no shame in asking for help. We do it all the time. If our cars aren't working, we go and take our car to a mechanic. If our teeth are hurting, we go to a dentist. And with our family or ourselves aren't travelling well, it's really important to reach out and have a chat to someone who can give you practical tools and strategies to be able to fix and repair and reconnect back to our family during these times. So I'm going to leave it there. For those of you that are interested, part of this series of workshops, we're going to be running some groups, and I'll be talking about these ideas in a little bit more in depth. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Simon. That was fantastic. And yeah, thank you for the heads up. We will talk a little bit more about. So these are a bit of a taster for those of you that are following us tonight. The other thing I also want to remind you, funnily enough, sometimes we get more women than men to these sorts of events. So if any of this is resonating with you and you think a man in your life, your partner, your brother, your father, your son might benefit from it. And remember, this is recorded. So please feel free to share this widely. We'll make this available after the show tonight. The thing I think that really resonated with me, Simon, is the barometer. That our kids are a barometer of how we're traveling. I think that's a really helpful thing to remember for all of us. Kids get fractious when they're little. It looks more obvious when they're 2. It's really obvious when they're 15. But it's really tempting to look to them as the source of the issue, that they're behaving in a way that is agitating us. And I think it's really helpful to think about, what are they bouncing off? They're bouncing off the tension in the room. You can talk about the good tension and the bad tension. You know when you've walked into a room and something has just gone down, and kids are responding to that all the time. So I think that's a really helpful reminder that if the kids are whoo, we like to blame the wind or other things. Sometimes it might just be mum's a little bit cranky. So yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you. Fantastic. Now I'm going to hand over with great pleasure to Michelle Roberts. Michelle is another person that I've had the pleasure of working with and learning from over the last number of years. Michelle is a psychologist and educator with many decades of experience working with children and families, and in particular with children and families that have had the misfortune of experiencing adversity such as disaster, bushfire, drought, and obviously COVID-19. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Michelle. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Nicola. And I think it's always a bit vexed being the last person. Sometimes it's a bonus as well. It's a bit like being the after lunch speaker, where you feel like you need to keep everyone awake just for that little bit longer. So bear with me. And when we were first thinking about how we would go about this taster, as Nicola's describing it, I very bravely said, I won't do slides because, people will be slided out maybe or whatever. And then I started to think about it, and I thought, given the time of night and given what I know about the impact of really stressful times on our ability to follow language, I thought it might have been a good way to model to you that we need to convey information in lots of ways, particularly after disasters, but especially in relation to stressful times. And here comes a stressful time, because I'm going to attempt to share my slides with you. Let's see how we go. So I thought we were roughly given 7 minutes. I would go with 7 key thoughts for 7 minutes. And I trust myself not to manage to do that in 7 minutes, but let's see how we go. The first thing I wanted to speak about was that in the days when I first began to do the work in bushfire situations, as it was in 1983, I was a first year out teacher in a bushfire affected area. And the thing I remember most about that was that we were told not to worry too much about the kids, that they were resilient. If we just got back on with things as though nothing had happened, they would pick up the ball and run with it from that point. And my experience wasn't that they were running with it as though nothing had happened. They were very aware of what had happened. They were struggling, they were forgetful, they were teary, they were angry, and they hated the fact that they had bushfire victim written across their forehead. And so it was important to me at that time to take into account that children and infants are not necessarily impervious to what's going on, but they can be resilient at the same time. And that it took a while for us as people who work in the disaster context to take into account that even our smallest, youngest individuals are impacted by stressful, confusing and terrifying times. Very little children take their reference point from the carers around them. Children, primary age children, start to think about what's going on but still look to you for their reference point, and young people often look to their peers and try and take independent action. It could be a one-off situation, such as a timed experience of a disaster with a start, a middle and an end, or something like we're in at the moment that's ongoing, long, and we're not quite sure where it's going to land and at what point. So it can be one-off or a long-term challenging ongoing adversity. The things that influence how children experience an event and what it looks like for them in terms of how they respond to it is to consider what their age is at the time, what their exposure's been, whether it's been direct or indirect exposure, what coping mechanisms they had before, during and after the event. They're all influences on how they cope with the situation. Thought number 2 was about meaning making, and the previous 2 speakers made some reference to this. We know that recovering from challenging situations is influenced by how much we understand about what's going on. And if we take into account that children are developing and their understanding of the world is developing, and they don't necessarily have a lot of time before the event to give them a perspective, it's really important that we provide some opportunity to understand what sense they're making of the situation. I know ourselves, we're struggling to make sense of the situation at this moment. And for some of our families, they've experienced drought, then they've had floods, then they've had fires, now they're in COVID, and they may have already had family-based adversities that they were dealing with. So understanding what's happening and how we can make sense of it's really important. And once again, we need to look at it from the child's perspective and see where they're at developmentally, what sort of kid are they, what's their personality, and so on. Research more recently has shown us that if children are able to take positive action when they're in a situation of duress or they're uncertain about what's going on, or in a disaster, for example, they often come out the other end a little stronger than if they had no agency or no ability to make a difference. So when children talk to me about their disaster experiences, they speak about the fact that they knew that it was their job to put wet towels at the bottom of the doors, or their job was to keep on handing damp face washes to the people who were in the smoke so that they could keep on doing the job that they were doing, or that they got to choose 3 special things at home that they could take as they were about to evacuate. So giving children agency, helping them to make meaning of the experience and to make sense of it, is a way in which we can help them in their coming through this in the best possible way that they can. One of the other things to think about is how you support your child when you yourself have been going through the tough time as well. I'm very aware of parents who are first responders. I'm very aware of parents who are atypical responders, such as myself, as a psychologist working with people in bushfire affected areas at the moment. Yet my own child and our family have been through bushfire circumstances. So some of you will be triggered or upset or distressed by your children's responses, and it'll be hard for you to support them in the way that you want to. The notion of being an expert companion is a really interesting one. And it resonated with me because of the experiences that I had had as a parent and in a bushfire situation myself. So Richard Tedeschi, and he's another person that Nicola will provide you with the reference to, has a theory of post-traumatic growth. And he says that really stressful, difficult times can cause traumatic stress, but it can go hand in hand with post-traumatic growth. And that's where you actually start to come out with some learnings, some positives, and even some new appreciation for life. And in this COVID period, there's been a lot of conversations around what's been the good bits and what have been the challenging bits. And I've heard lots of people make resolutions that they will nurture the things that they've rediscovered in this time of being forced to be inward looking and with their families and working from home. So how do you be an expert companion in partnering with your child as they go through the journey after adversity? Well, you look at how you can listen really carefully and where you can start from their starting point and how you can understand what it is that they understand themselves about what's happened. From my work in the 2009 bushfires with children, the big theme that kept on coming through was their distress that people had lost hope for them and that they thought that they would be permanently damaged by the experience. Their life would be forever altered in a negative way, and they felt that people had no expectations of them in terms of their ability to work, to behave, to engage, and to continue to grow. So our partnering has to be done with a measure of hope all the way through. So how do you be an expert companion in this circumstance? People previously have spoken time and time again about the importance of connection, and that is fundamental and foundational to engaging with our children and supporting them. Being available and reliable. When there's been a disaster, for example, the world becomes unpredictable and difficult to know how to navigate. And if we can bring some calm and some routine and some predictability back into life, it's reassuring, and it allows children to recenter and to start to trust that they can navigate the world again. Sometimes that's very hard to do when you yourself don't feel particularly grounded. And Simon spoke about self-regulation, and I'll talk in a minute about co-regulation and how you can help your children in that space as well. It's really a good opportunity to speak out loud about your thoughts and what your plans are, and to talk about your feelings and how your strategies are shaping to help you to manage the unknown and the difficult situations. Of course, you would always do that keeping in mind your child, the type of child they are, and their developmental level. We also know that if children don't get the opportunity to understand the situation, to talk about it with other people, they can really struggle, because sometimes not knowing what's going on or what's happened or not being able to make sense of it is worse than actually knowing that the fire came and we fought it, or we had to evacuate and we were frightened, but we're okay now. In the current cascade of events, again, going through our droughts, our bushfires, our floods, our COVID, and the other things that are happening in people's lives, one of the things that's emerging from the current 2019-2020 bushfires is how many young people are now putting their hand up for support, for some counselling, for some conversation with their wellbeing teachers at school, for example. And what we're finding is that they're not putting their hand up for themselves. They're actually coming to those sessions to ask how they can support their parents and their teachers. Because we know that if the adults in children's lives are managing and coping, the kids can feel that they can start to show how they're feeling, and then they'll start to manage and cope as well. So thought number 4 was about regulation, and it's about how you keep yourself functioning as best as you can, what your strategies are for when you're struggling, what your strategies are for when your children are struggling. And Nicola highlighted the notion of the barometer and checking in with yourself. Sometimes our children need to be encouraged to check in with themselves as well. In schools, we talk about innies and outies. And they sound like belly buttons, I know, but we're really talking about those children who internalise their distress and their feelings, who are the quiet ones, who often fly under the radar. They may be depressed, or anxious. The outies are those ones whose behaviour is often labelled as being naughty. But in fact, if we use our trauma lens, we can see that that behaviour may be related to the fact that they're just full of anxiety, worry, concern, anger, shame about the situation, struggling to understand it and struggling to work out how they can progress beyond that experience. So keep that trauma-informed lens well polished. Think about self-soothing, calm breathing, keeping yourself grounded and anchored, and helping your children by talking about what's working for you and what might work for them in this circumstance. Boundaries are an interesting dilemma for parents, I find, after a disaster, because everyone's just coping. They're surviving, they're not thriving necessarily, and it's really hard to have the energy to keep those family boundaries in place around behaviour. It's bedtime, it's 7:30, off you go. Child comes back, parent gives in because they think they've had a tough time, they need this support. That's actually the case, but they need the support to also go back to being able to go back to their bed, to feel safe, to feel that they can manage this, and that they know where the boundaries are, because if it's all over the place, then it still feels like it's out of control and unpredictable. So gentle and clear boundaries are really important. Good sleep is very, very important. And it's important for you to talk about what's okay behaviour and what's not, and how you might help your children in that circumstance. And you need to think about that for yourselves as well, as Simon indicated. And here we come to connection. I'm really going to be quite quick about this one because I think although none of us who presented tonight talked about the content that we were going to present, there's clearly some principles that resonate through all our work and what we see as being really important to parenting at any time, but to parenting when times are tough. And so not only do we need to connect with each other to know how we're travelling, so to connect with ourselves, but how can we facilitate our connection to others when we're in times of COVID? We know that young people, adolescents in particular, look to peer and really need to be trying to keep in contact as best they can. And for a lot of us at the moment, that's through social media. In my little town where I live, where we're not in as hard a lockdown as Melbourne township is, the city, there's activities within the community to bring people together with a sense of connection, and that's been this week through yarn bombing. So there are community activities that make me still feel connected to the outside world, although I'm quite locked down in my situation. And if we can think about ways in which you can facilitate your own connection to others and those of your children, it is helpful getting through this, and it gives a frame of reference that it's a shared adversity, but people have strategies that can make a good difference in the circumstance. And again, the theme that resonates through it, you need to look after yourself. We need to find ways that we can be calm. And when we're calm, we can co-regulate our children if they're struggling, or our partners. Simon did a lovely job of talking about the brain development and the way in which we can influence that, and the way that we can assist our children generally in times of adversity by assisting ourselves and making sure that we take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others that we care about. So I did think about the post-traumatic growth and the notion of how we can come through this better. So I added in a thought number 8, even though I was only going to do 7. And I think that it's about being able to reflect on extracting the wisdom from our challenging experiences. So if I can work out how to get out of this, I will leave you with those thoughts and pass back to Nicola, I think.
Thank you, Michelle. That was fabulous. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. So we had some cross conversation around broad areas to cover, but I think thankfully for parents and caregivers that are watching, you guys were very consistent. It'd be very frustrating and confusing if you were not. So thank you all for that. I think again, just picking up some of the highlights, and as that's the end of the presentation. So we've now got just over 15 minutes for Q&A, which is fantastic. So please, we've got a couple of questions coming in, and Laura and I rather, will tag team with them. I just want a couple of reflections. Gentle and clear boundaries, Michelle. I just love that terminology. I think every single one of us as parents and caregivers and aunties or uncles, friends, struggle with that at times, the temptation to be what we see as kind or soft. But any of us that have done any kind of bigger, stronger, wiser, kind, circle of security stuff, kids need both. And I think, you know, holding in your head when energy is low that it's tempting to let those boundaries slip. But we know they're going to have a horrible day tomorrow if they don't get sleep, and that you know we need the 5 minutes to settle them and let them know that, and let them know why we're doing it. I just love that gentle and clear boundary. We can hold that in our head of that's why we're doing it is a really great one to hold in mind. So we're going to throw to some questions and open it up. So please go for it. I know it's hard to think of questions where you're avidly listening to our speakers, so that's fantastic. We have had a couple of questions that have launched us off. We've also got just one more poll. This is something that we're really interested in, and this will help us as a Catlin. I didn't even tell you who we are. We work at the ANU. We support parents and children and families to influence what information and support that we can advocate for, what UNICEF Australia can advocate for. And this list is actually the list from UNICEF Australia's research with young people. So they did a survey with over 1,000 young people experiencing COVID-19 a few months ago. And these were the challenges that young people identified in their lives. So disruption to schooling and education, isolation, loneliness, and so on and so forth. So we thought, let's listen to the young people. This is what they've talked about, and be really helpful for us to get a metric of those of you that are here tonight to tell us what you're struggling with, and we can provide some information on that. But as we're doing this, we've had the first couple of questions are pretty consistent. So we've had questions from Karima, who we know, thank you Karima, but also another questioner from Gavin about talking to kids. So I was hoping we might throw to you perhaps first, Michelle, just some advice around talking to children of different ages about adversity, whether it's COVID or bushfire. You mentioned it a little bit, and then I might ask Simon or Lisa if they want to pitch in. How much should we share with children? What should we tell them? Karima has mentioned that her kids are constantly wanting to know when COVID will be over. So any advice, Michelle, on how much we share with our kids? You did mention it briefly, but did you want to expand on that a little bit?
You know, our views changed over the time I've been doing this work about how much we share with children, and my rule of thumb for myself in my work has always been I can always add more, but I can't take away if I tell too much detail. And so I start off very gently and I ask the child what do they think, and I get an insight into where they're at. If I don't know the child, and sometimes that happens when I'm working in a disaster and I come into a school, for example, or a community, then I do a lot of work to actually get a sense of that child's starting point, as I said, and I very gently begin the conversation with, what do you think? And eventually I'll work up to, and is there anything in this that's causing you a worry? Because what I want to do is create a sense of safety and agency for that child. So even a little 3-year-old can say to them, I was really upset because I left my teddy behind and it was going to get burnt down in the house. So then you can talk about, you know, when they're upset and how they felt about that and what strategies they used, what made them feel calm, who did they tell? And even at 3, you can talk about, and what will you do next time? And often the answer is, I'll take Teddy, or I won't worry about Teddy because I'd rather take Lammy, you know. So I think start with a little and add, and you look at where the child's at and you reassure and you come back to a point of safety and security.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That's fantastic. Simon, did you have anything to add from your perspective, talking to either kids of any age, maybe older kids, about circumstances, finances, jobs, those sorts of things? Would you share with them, or would you try and keep it to yourself?
I think as dads, we can get caught up in our own worlds of stress and our own, I guess, pain, as I said, and we can forget that for kids, taking into account their developmental framework, little things for them can be big things. For example, just asking your 8-year-old son, for example, to turn the TV off and come to dinner, and he's right in the middle of a show. And then you might go, well, he's not coming, I'll just go and turn the TV off. And then question, why are they so upset? And we forget that to turning the TV off in the middle of a show, well, we don't like it either. But for an 8-year-old, that's the equivalent of us losing our house. It's a big thing. And I think as parents, we get caught up in our stresses that we forget to sit down, as Michelle was saying, and have those age-appropriate conversations and find out what's happening in their world, because they do hear bits on the news. They do hear older siblings talk. They do hear parents talk to each other. So they pick up little bits and pieces here and there. And sometimes that can lead to an anxiety if we don't find time to sit down and have a chat. For the younger ones, the older ones, teenagers, sons and daughters, having those side-on-side conversations as we're driving somewhere or doing something, and just finding out what's happening for them in their world. Bearing in mind that for once adolescent boys hit about 12 or 13, they often drop into one-word syllables like, where you going? Nowhere. What are you doing? Nothing. Are you doing it with no one? And it's sometimes parents, especially mums, can feel a bit disconnected because they feel shut out of their son's life. but sons like talking, they just talk in a slightly different way. Not about feelings, but about what they're doing, what their mates are doing. So tailoring those conversations to the needs of your child is really, really important, and the age of your child.
It's fantastic. I was actually reading, there's a fantastic report, if anyone's interested, that's just come out today from New South Wales Children's Commissioner on kids' experience of disaster and bushfires. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Michelle probably has. One of the biggest comments children and young people said, and this is consistent in all the research that I've seen, particularly when you're talking about older kids and teens, is tell us what's happening. You don't have to share the details, as Michelle said, but don't pretend. It's nothing more frustrating for an adolescent than parents pretending that everything's okay. And it's patronising, it's invalidating, and they're very clearly telling us, give us some information and then involve me and give me some sense of agency about how we can help and feel engaged in that. But littlies, the trick is littlies are like, mum and dad, don't freak out, because that freaks me out if you seem too overwhelmed. So it's not easy, parents. We never said it was, but it makes sense when you think about it, that you can tell when your kids are ready for a bit more. They have some agency, as Michelle said, even from a really little age. But if we're feeling really, really overwhelmed, then it's probably when we go to other adults for support. Lisa, did you have anything to add to that about sharing information and what's helpful, what's overwhelm?
Just a little bit from a slightly different angle, I think, is the sense of staying with kids around, we can tell you some information, but we actually don't have the full answers yet. And it's horrible not knowing. And to join in that with kids, and you can do this at different age appropriate levels, but you can do this with littlies as well, in the sense of, what's the worst bit about not knowing for you? Where do you feel that in your body? Actually creating the space that if letting them cry around whatever is upsetting to them, even if we don't fully understand it. But what we know is, if we can cry, we can metabolize things, and often it can pass through us. It doesn't get stored in our body in that way. And joining with them in the sense of, it is horrible not knowing, and I'm here to be with you, and you have me, I have your back. I think that's the most important, it's an incredibly important message as well.
Fantastic. Let's throw to you, Laura. You got any other questions for our panel?
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, we've got a few more questions here. I think most of the panelists touched on the importance of your own mental health as a parent, and how well you're doing and how well you're taking care of your own well-being really will dictate what goes on with your children and what you see coming back from them. So a question about that to start us off, and perhaps maybe Lisa could get us started on this one. How would you suggest overcoming feelings of guilt when your own mental health is struggling? I'll just note that in our responses, the highest response back we got from the parenting challenges was managing that work-life balance. So I can totally empathize with a lot of parents feeling stressed and feeling that the balance in their lives is completely out of whack during these times. So maybe if you could touch on that a little bit.
So I read a lovely quote today that said, guilt should be used like salt in a recipe. A little bit of it's useful, but it should never be the full meal. And guilt informs us about what's important to us. I would encourage people to look at the work of Brené Brown, the difference between guilt and shame in this. Guilt does tell us, oh, hang on, I want to lift my game here. But if we get caught in I am terrible, I am awful, it actually distances us and stops us learning. So I would invite anyone to listen to, what is it that I'm feeling guilty about? And is this information about what matters to me? And is there a step I can take to addressing that? Now, that might be in terms of my own mental health. I think we all have to cut each other some grace in this period in terms of, and bring in some level of self-compassion around everyone is under a level of stress that is completely unusual. I think the best sometimes we can do is model to our children, actually, I'm not traveling really well, so I'm going to take a step out and take a few deep breaths and then step back in. I think, or maybe I'll hold it there and throw to the others while I'm collecting my thoughts as well, because I think it's a really complex question. And guilt is the hallmark of most parents, I think, and the term mother guilt is a strong one. So I think tending to that matters. Maybe Simon or Michelle, do you want to add a bit to what I've said?
I'll go first, Michelle, if you want. For a lot of guys, not all guys, of course, and it's very hard to stereotype because we're all different and we all react differently. But often mothers will internalise the guilt and fathers will externalise. So mums might blame themselves and a lot of dads might blame the environment around them, the kids being noisy and or the world or their partners. And I always talk to guys around the stresses they face. We externalise our internal stress. A lot of guys are stressed, and as I shared, a lot of guys feel guilt and shame plays a big part in men's lives, especially about not being there or not providing enough or not being able to care and protect for their families. I always talk to guys about that work-life balance, about, especially with little kids, you've got two jobs. You've got your day job and your night job. And your night job doesn't stop until they're in bed. So how do you make the transition between your day job and your night job? Just pulling over and listening to music, taking a deep breath, taking your running shoes in the car, going for a run, doing some kind of transition time between your day job and your night job is really important. Interestingly enough, from the research on the lockdowns, that dads were at home more than ever, but actual fact, and some of the research I've read, women's child rearing actually went up even though dads were home. And I think that's because when dads feel a bit guilty, we shut down and isolate rather than take the dog for a walk with the kids. I was talking to a lot of dads and they, rather than be involved with their family, because of the stress, they went out to the backyard with a beer and just wanted that space, which is good on some respects, but on other respects, too much isolation. And as we said, not enough disconnection can bring about those bad feelings as well. So a lot of the time for dads, I talk about just sharing the load with your partner or a mate, because as men, we don't often talk, and especially in communities that have been hit by disasters. I did a lot of work a few years ago under the drought funding, where I went out west working with the farmers who were going through a rough time. And I had, at one time, 40 farmers in the big shed, and I had them in groups of 8 with cards about what do you find difficult about being on the land? What do you find difficult about connecting with your kids? And once I got these really traditional blokey fathers talking, we couldn't kind of round it up. They just kept talking and talking because they found they had all similar issues and were struggling with similar things. So for guys, for me, it's very much about, rather than externalizing, looking at what's happening inside and connecting and talking to other blokes or your partners, people that are going through a similar experience, to get that normalization of what you're going through.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. I'm going to keep going just so we can answer some of the questions. I love the transition idea, Simon. I remember talking to some first responders last year when we were putting together the community trauma toolkit. And we were talking about that even when you get home and the kids all jump on you, whether, you know, mum or a dad, but you're grotty and you're grimy, even if you've been working as a lawyer, you feel grotty, you know. But saying to kids, I just need a shower. Let me go and have a shower. You might have a beer in the shower, whatever. But you've got to come back afterwards. You've got to follow through. So you say, let me have a shower, let me have 5 minutes, let mum get into a tracky pants, whatever it is, but you've got to come back then. And then you can have that few minutes to transition. And when kids will learn that if you do follow through, they'll come back. So Michelle, I'm going to throw to you merge a couple of questions from the audience. Sales manager is talking about a child, 5-year-old, who has a lot going on. Pandemic, new house, new school, moving. And somebody else, Jackie, asking about examples to give kids and toddlers a sense of agency. I think potentially we could answer, kind of bundle those two together. Any tips for those younger kids, how we give them some sense of agency with
Yeah.
all that's going on?
Yeah, if we start off and we focus on COVID with the preschool age children, one, there's the Birdie's Tree resources, Nicola, that would be really useful for people to see and give them some ideas of how they can work with their children that are that little around agency. But I think, you know, really basic things like I'm seeing in preschools and in childcare centres, they're teaching the really little ones how to wash their hands very carefully. And I know that there's been some episodes on Bluey and some of the things that the children watch that are geared towards that as well. That's giving them agency, because then you can speak with them about keeping their hands clean when they come from being outside where there are other people is a good way to keep them healthy, and, you know, to cough or sneeze into the elbow rather than over everybody else, for example. They're signs of agency for those little ones, because they're contributing to the solution to a problem that we're trying to work out at the moment. The other question in relation to the 5-year-old that's experiencing a whole lot of change, if we put some caveats in around my answer here, because I don't know this little person and I don't really know what their temperament is. Are they outgoing normally, or are they a shy child? Have they had lots of change before this? So here's the big stereotypic answer, and pick out of it what might be useful for you, knowing your child. Lots of change at the same time is challenging for everyone. And I think when we're all dealing with lots of change, and I certainly know I've been dealing with a lot of change in this time, as have most people, I try and find something that is within my control and that I can do regularly. So for your 5-year-old, there might be a routine that they especially like, and it might be going for a walk with you. It might be having their special toy with them. It might be watching a show with you, but it's something that's got a point of connection where you can provide them with the anchor point. And I've spoken about anchor points before. Parents can be anchors for children when there's a lot of change around them. Siblings can be anchors as well. So try and find something that's calming, soothing, predictable, and allows that child to feel anchored in a time of change. And hopefully that's a good thing for that little person.
Thank you, Michelle. We're out of time. That always happens. We think we're going to have heaps of time. But the good thing is that that's why we're doing these follow-up webinars. So just to remind you, before you jump off, when you jump off, we were asked to do the survey, please do it. We'd really appreciate the feedback. We will also send out the link. At the end of the survey, you'll also get a chance to tick a box if you'd be interested in being involved in any of the ongoing webinars. So just to remind you, there'll be 3 sessions, probably about 90 minutes each. So one will be myself and Lisa. One will be myself and Simon, and one will be myself and Michelle. And so a dozen adults in each of those groups for 3 weeks to dive a little bit deeper into the topics we've raised today. So hopefully we've piqued your curiosity. Thank you everybody for coming along and joining us tonight. Thank you all of the panelists for agreeing to be part of that. Thank you, Laura, for all your phenomenal organisation, and none of this would go ahead without her. And thank you to Nicole and the team of UNICEF Australia for making this all possible. Look after yourselves, everybody. Take care, be kind to yourselves, and I really hope to see some of you in the ongoing sessions that we run. But other than that, thank you and good night.